Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The marks that crawl. I noticed the first handprint on a Tuesday evening, just as the last slivers of daylight were sinking behind the buildings across the street. My apartment sat high on the third floor, with windows that offered a darkened view of the alley below. I'd just settled down with a glass of wine when a small, faint smudge on the window caught my eye. It was small, delicate, and unmistakably a handprint, its 5 tiny fingers pressed against the glass. I'd never thought of myself as someone who could be easily shaken, but this. It was odd. There was no rational way a child's handprint could be on my window. No one had visited in days. I pushed it out of my mind. It's just grime, I muttered, trying to reassure myself. Still, I found myself staring at it long after the sun had set, the small print visible in the glow of the streetlights outside. Something about the print's shape, the delicate arch of the fingers, the small spread of the palm, seemed impossibly perfect. But I wiped it away with a rag, determined to move on with my evening. Then, the next morning, there were more. They appeared on 3 different windows this time, each one identical to the last. The same size, the same pattern, as if the same tiny hand had crawled across the glass, lingering at each spot before moving on. My stomach twisted as I examined them, brushing my fingertips over each print. "This is absurd," I whispered, looking over my shoulder as if someone might be watching. I lived alone, and I'd never had a problem with strangers or intruders. But this was something different. I shivered, feeling a chill that seemed to creep up from the handprints and settle deep in my bones. I decided to call my best friend, Will. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, sorry, it's early, everything okay?" His voice was laced with grogginess. "Will, it's not normal," I said quickly, struggling to find the right words. "There are these handprints on my windows. Like, small child-sized handprints. They shouldn't be there. I live on the 3rd floor." There was a pause. Maybe it's just some prank or something? You know, kids messing around. But I could hear the unease creeping into his tone. He knew as well as I did that it didn't make sense. "Have you seen anyone?" "No," I replied, staring at the marks as if they might shift right in front of me. "It's just me here. And Will, I'm telling you, they're not normal. They're like cold." Will's silence hung over the line before he spoke again. "Look, I'm coming over after work, all right? Just keep your doors locked." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. I wanted to argue, to tell him I wasn't scared. But as I stared out at the empty cityscape through the glass, I realized that the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. There was a strange heaviness in the air, pressing in around me, as if something were coiled and waiting, watching from beyond the glass. And in that quiet morning light, I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection, something impossibly small and faint, just behind my shoulder. That night, I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those tiny handprints multiplying, covering every inch of my windows. I tossed and turned until a strange sound pulled me from my uneasy dreams. It was faint, almost indiscernible, like the soft patter of bare feet on hardwood floors. I held my breath, heart thudding against my ribs, straining to hear any hint of movement beyond the door to my bedroom. The footsteps, if that's what they were, had stopped. Only silence greeted me in the dark. I glanced at my phone, 3:08 a.m. with a sigh. I pushed the covers aside and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water. The shadows felt too thick, pressing against me as I passed each window, and the air was thick with an unshakable sense of being watched. Just as I reached the sink, I caught sight of something in the window. Another handprint, this one larger and more pronounced, fingers stretched wide, almost as if pressed in fear or desperation. My breath hitched, and I took an involuntary step back. "Will," I whispered to myself. He had promised to come by, but he hadn't called. Had he seen these prints and thought better of coming? Or worse, had he seen something that scared him away? I was reaching for my phone when I heard it, a voice, quiet and small, coming from the hallway. It sounded like a child, just barely above a whisper. "Are you afraid?" The voice asked, delicate and somehow playful, like a child's sing-song taunt. My blood turned to ice. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. I forced myself to stay still, though every fiber of my being screamed to run. There was no reply, only the silence stretching out longer, filled with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. My eyes darted to the shadowed hallway, hoping I'd imagined the voice. Then I saw it, a small figure, pale and slender, standing just at the edge of the darkness. Its face was partially obscured, but I could make out its wide, dark eyes staring at me, unblinking and filled with something close to hunger. It raised one tiny hand and pressed it against the wall, leaving a faint smear, as if its hand were wet. "Don't you want to play?" It whispered, voice carrying an edge of something unnatural, something that twisted each word into a threat. I staggered back, my hands fumbling for something to defend myself with. "Get out," I hissed, barely able to force the words out. "I don't know what you are, but you need to leave." The figure didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head, lips curling into a strange, almost tender smile. "We just want to come in. We're cold. And we're so hungry." Before I could scream, the lights flickered, plunging the apartment into darkness. I felt it then, a coldness settling over me, chilling me to my core. My eyes darted around in the blackness, desperate to find anything, but the childlike figure had vanished. Only the handprints remained, slowly appearing one by one on the walls, crawling closer toward me as if in some dark ritual. I stumbled back, my chest tight with fear as I slammed myself into the corner, whispering desperately to myself, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But in the growing dark, I felt their gaze, closer than ever, waiting for me to make the next move. The morning sunlight brought no comfort, only the ugly sight of smeared handprints dotting nearly every wall. They were scattered, climbing up the walls in patterns that made my stomach turn. Some were smeared, as if something had dragged its hand down slowly, leaving faint, wet trails in their wake. Exhausted, I scrubbed at them, desperate to erase every mark, to feel in control again. The physical effort was grounding, but the memories of the night before lingered, crawling under my skin. True to his word, Will showed up around noon, his eyes widening when he took in the scene. "What happened here?" He stopped, his gaze locked on a series of prints that lined the doorway. "Are you okay? You sound terrible on the phone." I nodded, trying to steady myself. "Will, it's more than just handprints now." My voice trembled, and I swallowed hard. There was a voice last night, a child's voice. It said it was cold and hungry. And I saw something, a figure, small, pale. It looked like a child, but there was something wrong, something I can't explain. Will's face darkened. He looked around, then lowered his voice. "Look, I didn't want to scare you, but I read up on this place after your call. Apparently, a kid fell from this building years ago, from this very floor. People said his spirit never left." He paused, glancing at the window. I didn't believe it at first, but now. A shiver ran down my spine. Why wouldn't they say something when I moved in? Will's jaw clenched. Maybe they didn't want to scare off a paying tenant. Or maybe they didn't believe it either. He reached out, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Let's get out of here, just for tonight. We'll get some distance, figure out what to do next." But as I opened my mouth to agree, something cold brushed against my arm. I froze, glancing down to see the faint outline of a handprint on my bare skin. It was as if a child had pressed its fingers into my flesh, leaving a dark, bruised impression. I recoiled, looking wildly around, but nothing was there. Only Will, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," I whispered, voice barely audible. They don't want me to leave." Just then, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the faint echo of laughter, childlike, yet hollow, filled the air. Will stumbled back, gripping my arm tightly. "This isn't right. We need to go, now." I nodded, feeling my heart pound as we hurried toward the door. But the closer we got, the louder the laughter grew, rising and falling in mocking, high-pitched tones. The door slammed shut before we could reach it, locking us inside. I grabbed the handle, pulling desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter turned to whispers, voices layering over one another, filling the room like a creeping fog. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. What do you want? For a long moment, only silence answered. Then, from somewhere behind us, the same soft voice I'd heard in the night answered, as if right beside me. You. We just want you. I gasped, turning to find myself alone. Will had vanished. Panic surged as I called his name, but there was no response. Only the handprints, now moving across the walls, circling me in a slow, deliberate spiral. Each print seemed to reach toward me, pressing in closer, closer, until the room itself seemed to shrink, trapping me in its icy grasp. My voice was barely a whisper as I backed into the corner, clutching the door handle behind me. I pulled and pulled, but it remained frozen. And in the dim light, the handprints multiplied, inching closer, until I realized they were forming a word on the walls, a single chilling command written in dozens of tiny hands: stay. I don't know how long I was there, staring at the word stay scrawled across my walls. It felt like the room itself was breathing, the air dense and suffocating. My heart hammered as I looked around, praying for some sign of Will, but he was gone, as if he'd been swallowed up by the very walls. The silence closed in, thick and oppressive, broken only by faint, dragging sounds that grew closer with every passing second. Then, from the dark hallway, the child's voice returned, thin and high-pitched. You stayed. Good. The tone was deceptively sweet, a mockery of innocence, and I shuddered. We're so hungry, aren't you? The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, curling around me like smoke. My throat was dry. What are you? I managed to choke out, clutching at the walls for support. Why are you doing this? A chorus of whispers filled the room, layering over each other like a tangle of voices, each one dripping with need, with hunger. We are the lost. Forgotten. Cold and alone. Left behind. But you invited us in. The voices twisted together, forming something that felt like laughter. You touched us. Saw us. I staggered backward, my gaze darting from one handprint to another, watching as they seemed to pulse and grow, stretching out, transforming into shapes that defied logic. Shadows unfurled across the floor, rising up like twisted, sinewy limbs, reaching toward me. No, I didn't mean to. I stumbled over my words, my voice raw with terror. But the truth was undeniable. Every time I'd touched a handprint, every moment I'd lingered, I had, in some twisted way, invited them closer. The laughter grew, a high-pitched giggle layered with malice. We're so close now. You're almost one of us. Desperation took over. I scrambled toward the window, fumbling with the lock. If I could just make it to the fire escape, I could get out, leave this nightmare behind. But as I slid open the window, the laughter turned into a scream, sharp and filled with fury. The shadows shot out, wrapping around my wrists, yanking me back from the ledge with a strength that left me gasping. The small, icy hands pressed against my skin, pinning me to the ground. A face appeared above me, its features twisted and wrong, eyes dark and endless, filled with an insatiable hunger. Stay with us, it whispered, mouth curling into a grotesque grin. I thrashed, trying to pull away, but the shadows held firm. The face leaned closer, and I could feel the coldness leaching into me, spreading through my limbs like ice. No. Let me go. I screamed, fighting to break free, but the shadows were relentless, pressing down until the air was crushed from my lungs. Just then, a familiar voice broke through the darkness, Will's voice, faint but steady. You have to fight it. They feed on fear, don't give them what they want. His words sparked something within me. Summoning every ounce of strength, I forced myself to look away from the eyes, to ignore the whispers clawing at my mind. The shadows trembled, loosening their grip just enough for me to break free. I scrambled toward the window, throwing myself onto the fire escape just as the room erupted into a chorus of shrieks, the hungry cries filling the air like a swarm. I stumbled down the metal stairs, looking back only once. In the window, a crowd of small, dark eyes watched me, their faces twisted with fury and longing. One hand reached out, pressing against the glass, fingers splayed. It was the same tiny print that had started it all, only now, it was larger, hungrier, as if waiting for another chance. The last sound I heard before sprinting into the night was that sing-song voice, carrying on the cold wind, whispering with a promise that sent chills down my spine. "We'll be waiting. Hey. Subscribe for more true scary stories." Story 2. Beneath the Whispering Shadows. It started as a faint whisper. Just the softest murmur, drifting through the silence of my darkened bedroom. I'd grown used to the oppressive quiet, the way the shadows seemed to gather more thickly around me since I'd moved into the old house. There was a certain melancholy to the place, its walls lined with a patchwork of peeling wallpaper and uneven wooden floors that groaned like weary bones. But that night, something was different, something unsettlingly new had woven itself into the air, brushing the edge of my awareness. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The house sat alone on a forgotten stretch of road, tucked into the woods with trees that loomed close and tall, casting long, skeletal shadows. But no, the sound wasn't the wind. This whisper seemed directed, like it was meant for me alone, urging me into a restless state somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. "It's all right," it cooed in a raspy but strangely soothing tone. "I'm here. You're safe." The voice was faint, almost maternal, as if it were wrapping me in a blanket of reassurance. I lay still, every muscle tense. It made no sense, yet something in the voice seemed to understand me, my doubts, my fears, the ache of solitude that gnawed at me nightly. I couldn't help but respond, whispering back, "Who are you?" My voice barely made a sound, but as the words left my mouth, the air felt heavier, thickened with something ancient and watchful. The whisper continued, calm and unwavering. "Don't worry, child. I'll keep you safe." The following night, the voice returned, a low hum breaking the quiet just as my eyelids began to droop. It came from somewhere beneath me, but when I checked under the bed, only darkness met my gaze. The bed's shadow stretched and distorted, blacker than the night itself, an unsettling depth that seemed to breathe as I stared. I tried to shake off the chill that crept up my spine and climbed back into bed, feeling both ridiculous and profoundly disturbed. But as I closed my eyes, the whispering resumed, "Sleep now. I'm right here." By the third night, the voice had grown stronger, no longer confined to a barely there murmur. It filled my room, almost as if it had substance. Each night it seemed to know more about me, as if it were drinking in my thoughts. "I know you're afraid. But you're never alone. I'll be here as long as you need me." The voice paused, almost as if waiting for a response. My heart pounded as I hesitated, not knowing what answer it expected. I wanted to shout, to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, tangled in confusion and dread. Instead, I whispered, "Why are you here?" There was a long, drawn-out silence, so intense it became a presence in itself. Finally, the whisper returned, edged with something darker. "Because you called me." Those words tightened around me like a vice. I hadn't called anyone, I hadn't summoned anything. But then a shiver of memory flared up, almost too brief to grasp, a childhood ritual, a game I'd forgotten about, something I'd chanted late at night when the darkness felt unbearable. Had I somehow brought this thing to me? That night, as I lay there, the voice grew clearer, deeper, almost like a growl hidden beneath its soothing tones. "You don't need anyone else. You need me. Only me." The shadows under the bed seemed to swell and pulse, pressing out into the room, making my skin crawl with each heartbeat. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was speaking to me wasn't simply under my bed, it was becoming a part of it, seeping into the walls, the air, the very bones of the house. The nights grew longer, or maybe it was just that sleep felt so elusive. Each time I lay down, I'd listen for the voice, a dreadful anticipation tightening my chest. And every time, like clockwork, it would return. It was waiting for me now, deep and low, weaving itself through the silence like smoke. "You're safe with me," it murmured. The words had once sounded reassuring, but now there was something possessive, almost venomous, laced in their tone. One night, I forced myself to reply. "What do you want?" My voice trembled in the thick darkness, but I knew I needed to confront it, to try to understand what this presence was. The voice laughed, a dry, brittle sound, like leaves scraping over a stone. "Oh, I don't want anything. I am here because you wanted me here." The accusation in its tone made my blood run cold. I could feel its presence more acutely, as though it were stretching up from beneath the bed, growing bolder, more solid. I tried to push the voice out of my mind, to ignore it, hoping that maybe if I stopped responding, it would fade. But each time I ignored it, it retaliated with whispers darker and more personal, revealing secrets even I'd tried to forget. "You were always afraid, weren't you?" it hissed one night. "Even as a child, the shadows were your friends. You wanted someone who understood. Someone like me." Its voice crawled up from under the bed, coiling around my ears like a snake. I pressed my hands to my ears, heart racing. But the voice only laughed again, louder this time, reverberating off the walls, growing more insistent. One night, I decided to confront whatever was beneath me. Gathering my courage, I climbed out of bed and knelt down, pressing my ear to the floor, inches from the bed's edge. The wood was icy, as if the warmth of the house refused to touch it. For a moment, there was only silence, and I began to wonder if I'd finally driven the thing away. But then, from beneath the floorboards, a sound echoed, a scratching, like claws scraping at the wood, dragging slowly and deliberately. "I'm so close," it whispered, so near I could feel the chill of its breath. "Closer than you know." I stumbled back, gasping, watching as the darkness under the bed seemed to crawl outward, black tendrils creeping over the floor toward me. They moved as though alive, slithering with purpose, feeding on my fear. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, mesmerized by the sight of the shadows weaving together, growing thicker, darker, almost forming a shape. That night, I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, cold and suffocating. When I finally drifted off near dawn, the voice slipped into my dreams, whispering promises and threats alike. "You don't need them, any of them. I'm all you'll ever need. Forever." Its words echoed in my head long after I woke, clinging like cobwebs. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrapping itself around my life, feeding off my isolation. The next day, as evening settled, I felt a strange urge, almost a compulsion, to stay in my room, to listen. Part of me wanted to resist, but something stronger held me there, glued to the bed as the light faded, waiting for the voice. And right on cue, it arrived, soft and patient. "Good," it cooed. "You're learning to listen. You're learning to obey." The way it said the last word twisted my stomach. Obey? Obey what? It sounded as if it expected me to serve it, to belong to it, as though I had somehow entered into a dark pact without realizing it. And yet, despite the dread pulling in my stomach, a quiet part of me craved its attention, its company. I was drawn to the voice as much as I feared it, as if it filled an emptiness I'd always carried with me. But as the shadows lengthened, something gnawed at the edges of my mind, a realization creeping up, more terrifying than anything I'd felt before. The voice didn't just come from beneath the bed. No, it was coming from inside the walls, seeping up through the floorboards, filling the very air I breathed. The following nights passed in a haze of terror and exhaustion. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and shadows bled into every corner of the room, I felt the voice tightening its grip on me. It would murmur to me, "Closer now," almost brushing my ear with every word, and I could feel the weight of its unseen presence bearing down on my chest. But worse than the whispers were the things I started to see, flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, small shapes slipping in and out of the dark. One night, I thought I saw fingers, thin and pale, curling out from beneath the bed, retreating just as quickly when I turned my head. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, the tricks of a sleep-deprived mind, but the voice fed on my disbelief, seeming to grow bolder, more insistent. "Come closer," it purred. "You're almost ready." Those words filled me with dread. Ready for what? I had no answer, and I didn't want one. I just wanted it to leave, but it was as if my fear and confusion only fed it, binding me more tightly to it. That night, I forced myself out of bed and bolted out of the room, trying to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to cling to me. I found myself in the narrow, musty hallway outside my door, leaning against the wall, heart pounding. The silence was thick, pressing down on me. But even in the hallway, I could feel its presence, watching, lurking, waiting for me to return. A sickly realization dawned on me: I was no safer outside the room than within it. The voice, the presence. It wasn't confined to my bedroom. It was everywhere. In a shaky voice, I whispered, "Leave me alone." My voice barely held any conviction, and in response, the voice let out a guttural laugh that reverberated through the house, slipping from every shadowed corner. "You don't want me gone," it murmured. "I am the only one who truly knows you." The way it spoke made my skin crawl, each word sinking into my bones. "You let me in," it continued, voice dripping with satisfaction. "Remember? You wanted someone who would never leave." A memory surfaced, unbidden, an image of myself, years younger, clutching a stuffed animal, whispering into the dark as a child. I'd been so scared back then, pleading with the shadows to keep me safe, to bring me someone who'd always protect me. Had it heard me even then? Had it answered, lying in wait, biding its time? I stumbled back into the bedroom, shivering, but the second I crossed the threshold, the door swung shut behind me with a loud thud. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped around, trying to open it. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. From the other side of the room, the voice sighed, almost delighted. "Now you understand," it said, its tone low and thrumming with satisfaction. "We are bound, you and I." I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. The darkness had thickened, almost like ink spilling over the floor, climbing up the walls in a restless, writhing mass. In the center, a shape began to emerge, something vaguely human, yet grotesquely wrong. It had limbs, long and thin, twisted unnaturally as if formed from shadow itself, with eyes that glowed faintly from the blackness. "Don't be afraid," it whispered, stepping closer. "This is what you wanted." I pressed myself against the door, trying to pull it open with all my strength, but my hand slipped uselessly, numb with terror. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. This isn't what I wanted." But the creature's grin widened, revealing too many teeth, sharp and jagged. "You invited me," it hissed, each word sinking deeper into me. "You needed me." It leaned in closer, its eyes narrowing to slits, inches from my face. "And now, I'm finally home." Its face hovered inches from mine, and I could smell its breath, a mix of rot and damp earth, ancient and decaying, like something unearthed from a place forgotten. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed myself harder against the door, desperate to get away. But there was no escape, I was trapped, and it knew it. The creature's eyes glittered with a dark satisfaction, drinking in my fear as if it were a fine wine. "We've waited long enough," it said, voice curling around me, filling the room with a sinister echo. Somehow, I found my voice, though it was little more than a hoarse whisper. What are you?" The question slipped out involuntarily, as though some part of me needed to understand what had ensnared me. The creature tilted its head, a mockery of thoughtfulness, its too wide smile never faltering. "I am what you needed," it answered, almost tenderly. "Your comfort in the dark, the answer to your whispered fears. I am the promise you made long ago, given form." It stepped closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, seeping into my skin, as though it were merging with the very air around us. I shook my head, clinging to the shreds of denial. "I never wanted this, I never wanted you." My voice cracked, my words tinged with desperation. But the creature only laughed, low and hollow. "Oh, but you did. When you were young, you called out into the shadows, longing for someone to take away your fears. You wanted someone who would never leave you. And now, I am bound to you, and you to me." It raised one skeletal hand and stretched it toward me, its fingers long and clawed, curling through the air as though to caress me. I shuddered, feeling the icy trail of its presence before it even touched me. "Together," it whispered, "we will never be alone again." The words filled me with a dread so complete that I could barely breathe. But a strange compulsion tugged at me from somewhere deep inside, a remnant of the desperate child I once was, a part of me that wanted to reach out, to accept the creature's offer. In a last-ditch effort to break free, I whispered, "I release you. I take back whatever I said." My voice quivered, the words weak and unsure, but I held onto the slim hope that maybe, somehow, I could sever the bond. The creature paused, its face twisting into an expression of cold amusement. "Release me?" It mocked, the shadows around it trembling with dark energy. "There is no release. I am bound to you as you are to me. I have waited, I have listened, and now that I am here, there is no going back." Desperation clawed at my throat, but before I could scream, the creature's hand shot out, wrapping around my wrists with a strength that felt like iron, though its touch was as cold as ice. "Hush now," it murmured, pulling me forward. This is what you wanted, even if you didn't understand it. Its words slithered through my mind, clouding my thoughts, filling every empty space within me until I felt I might drown in them. And then, in a terrible moment of clarity, I realized it was true. There was a dark, twisted part of me that had called this thing into existence, that it wanted its companionship, no matter how horrifying. I closed my eyes, a sick acceptance settling over me. And as I did, I felt its presence seep into me, filling me with a coldness so profound that I thought I might shatter. The room began to fade, swallowed by the darkness, until there was nothing left but the sound of the creature's voice, whispering softly in my ear, soothing me like a lullaby. "You're safe now," it purred, each word sinking deeper. "You'll never be alone again. Not in the dark. Not ever." In that last, shivering moment of consciousness, I understood that I was no longer just myself. The creature was within me, fused to me, its whispers an eternal shadow that would follow me forever. And then, just before everything went black, I heard it murmur, "Sleep, my dear. This is only the beginning." Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Mirror's Gaze. When I first spotted the mirror at the old estate auction, it was tucked in a corner, half hidden beneath dusty velvet drapes. Yet, something about it caught my eye, a pull I couldn't ignore. The frame was ornate, forged in dark mahogany with carvings that twisted into monstrous faces, their hollow eyes boring into anyone who dared to look at them too long. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd normally be drawn to, but it was as if it wanted me to find it, to bring it home. I reasoned with myself that it was a unique piece, a talking point, nothing more. So, I won it with a single bid. And from the moment it entered my apartment, the air felt different. After the movers propped it up in my living room, I stood back, admiring the warped, antique glass. That's when I noticed the room and the reflection. It was not my own. A chill slid down my spine as I studied the image, faded, dusty furniture arranged just slightly off kilter, as if the room had been abandoned halfway through decorating. There was an armchair near the corner, a crooked picture frame on the wall, and drapes that seemed to sway, although I felt no breeze. "It's just a trick of the glass," I told myself, laughing off the prickling dread. "It's an old mirror, maybe the glass is distorted." That first night, I tried to ignore it, but every time I passed by, I found myself glancing at that foreign room in the reflection. When I turned on the lights in my own apartment, I half expected the strange room to light up too, but it remained dim, as if the light never reached it. Around midnight, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, mesmerized. I reached out to touch the glass, feeling the cool, smooth surface under my fingers. But the room and the reflection remained unreachable, fixed just beyond my touch. And then, I swear I saw it, a flicker of movement. Just a shadow, maybe, near the back corner, behind the armchair. "Probably just tired," I muttered, peeling myself away from the mirror. But that night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of my apartment made me imagine someone, or something, moving in that reflected room. I tossed and turned, telling myself it was nonsense, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something. Something was in that room, waiting. The next day, I almost convinced myself to return the mirror, but curiosity had lodged itself deep within me. Instead, I spent the day staring at it, scrutinizing every detail of the reflection. My own reflection seemed faint, nearly transparent, as if I wasn't fully there. And then I saw it, a subtle change in the room. The armchair had shifted, angled ever so slightly toward the mirror. Toward me. "Who's there?" I found myself whispering to the empty glass, feeling absurd. But silence pressed back against me, thick and heavy. Just before bed, I took one last look, hoping to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. The room looked the same as before, dark and empty. But as I turned to leave, I felt eyes on me, watching. There was a weight in the air, a foreboding presence that lingered, invisible but undeniable. And even though I knew it was impossible, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, drawing closer, a slow approach from within that strange, forsaken room. The following morning, I tried to push the mirror from my thoughts. I made coffee, caught up on work, did everything I could to stay busy and avoid glancing at it. But the sense of dread hadn't left me. It clung to the corners of my mind like a spider's web, thin and sticky, something I couldn't brush away. The room in the mirror haunted me. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't stop wondering what, or who, might be lurking in that shadowy space. By afternoon, I found myself drawn back to it, pulled by an invisible thread. The room in the mirror was dark, the same as before, but now the armchair had moved even closer, right in the center of the room. A strange, feverish curiosity seized me, a need to understand what I was seeing. The chair looked like it had been dragged, gouging heavy lines into the dust-covered floor. Every detail seemed sharper than the day before, as if the room was coming into focus bit by bit, revealing itself to me. "This is impossible," I muttered, forcing a shaky laugh. "Talking to yourself already?" came a voice from behind. I jumped, heart pounding, and turned to see my friend, Lena, standing in the doorway. She'd let herself in, clearly sensing something was wrong. "You've got to stop scaring yourself, Alex." She crossed her arms, casting a skeptical look at the mirror. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a thin smile. "I don't know, Lena. Something about this mirror is off." I watched her expression shift from skepticism to curiosity as she moved closer to it, squinting at the reflected room. She frowned. "That doesn't look like your living room." I nodded, feeling relieved that she could see it too. "Exactly. And every day, something changes." Her fingers traced the mirror's edge, and she shivered as if she'd felt a chill. "It's creepy, but it's just a mirror, right?" she said, trying to sound nonchalant. Yet, she stepped back quickly, almost tripping as she moved away from it, her face pale. She laughed it off, but the uneasy look in her eyes told me she sensed the same dread. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a final glimpse of the room. This time, it felt even closer, more intimate. The chair had turned fully to face the mirror, angled so that anyone sitting in it would be looking directly at me. My pulse raced as I took in the details, the fabric of the chair, worn and torn, the dust settled thickly on every surface, and in the darkness, a faint, almost imperceptible figure. Just an outline, a shadow of something, or someone, seated in the chair. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, seated in the chair, staring at me. In the dead silence of my apartment, I began to hear things, faint creaks, soft whispers, the shuffling of feet. I told myself it was my imagination, the tricks of a mind primed with fear, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Not from my apartment, but from the other side of the mirror. From that room. In the darkness, I walked back to the mirror, heart pounding. And there it was. The shadow was unmistakably there now, sitting as if waiting. My own reflection seemed to pale beside it, almost fading as the dark figure sharpened into clarity, coming closer, closer. A single thought chilled me to the bone. It wanted me to see it, to know it was coming. The following days felt like a waking nightmare. Every time I looked into the mirror, the figure in the chair had shifted, growing more defined, almost solid. I could make out details now, a gaunt, elongated face, eyes like hollow pits, staring with a dreadful, unbroken intensity. Each day, it seemed closer, as though it had been inching forward in the night, crossing a boundary I hadn't known existed. It filled the reflection with an oppressive darkness, a presence that bled into my apartment, heavy and suffocating. My sleep was wrecked, haunted by nightmares of that figure stepping out of the mirror and into my home. The line between sleep and waking blurred. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear faint whispers echoing in my mind, words I couldn't understand, but their intent felt hostile. I became desperate, afraid even to turn my back on the mirror. I called Lena again, hoping she'd agree to take the mirror off my hands, maybe even take it out of my apartment entirely. She listened quietly as I explained, her voice gentle but tense. "Alex, you sound like you're slipping. Maybe you should just get rid of it. Leave it outside, throw it in the trash." "I can't," I replied, voice trembling. "I feel like it's watching me. Like it knows I'm here." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "Look, I can come over tomorrow. We'll handle it together, okay?" I agreed, relieved to have someone else face it with me. Still, her voice had a strained, uncertain edge to it, like she didn't believe she could truly help. That night, I barely slept. Every hour, I would sit up, checking the mirror from my bed. Each time, I found the shadow closer, more distinct. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard a scratching sound, a faint, rhythmic scrape. My skin prickled as I realized the sound was coming from the mirror. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed, gripping my phone tightly, inching closer. The figure's face was clearer now, its eyes dark and endless. It looked back at me with a hunger that made my blood freeze. And then it smiled, lips pulling back into a ghastly, unnatural grin. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over myself in a frantic effort to put space between us. But when I looked away, something colder than fear gripped me. The reflection of the room didn't disappear when I turned. The same dusty, decayed space lingered at the edge of my vision, as if the mirror's reality had started seeping into my own. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could hardly breathe, paralyzed by the knowledge that whatever was in that room wanted out. In desperation, I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, hoping to smother its gaze. The scratching stopped, but I could still feel it. Something pacing, trapped behind the thin veil of fabric, almost mocking me with its proximity. It wasn't over. I knew it was still watching, still waiting for the right moment. When morning came, I was exhausted, haggard, but somehow, seeing daylight felt like salvation. I resolved that, tonight, I wouldn't sleep at all. I'd stay up until Lena arrived, and together we would get rid of the cursed thing. But as I turned away from the covered mirror, I caught something in the corner of my eye, a faint movement, a tiny shift beneath the blanket. I knew what it meant. Whatever had been confined to that room, whatever terrible thing I'd allowed into my life, was still moving. And it was closer than ever. That night, I waited in the living room, the blanket still draped over the mirror like a desperate barrier. I'd locked every door, shut every window, and left every light on. I kept checking my phone, my messages from Lena unanswered, her arrival time long past. The silence stretched on, thick and smothering. Minutes ticked by, each one intensifying the dread gnawing at me. Every fiber of my being told me I wasn't alone. At some point, I heard it again, that unmistakable, relentless scratching. It was fainter this time, but rhythmic, like nails dragging down the back of my mind, tearing my sanity thread by thread. I sat motionless, clutching my phone with sweaty hands, my gaze locked onto the covered mirror. The scratching grew louder, vibrating through the floor, worming its way into my bones. And then, to my horror, I saw the blanket move, shifting ever so slightly as if something was pushing against it from the other side. In a surge of panic, I shouted, "Stop! Just stop!" My voice cracked in the silence, breaking under the strain of my terror. But the scratching didn't stop, it intensified, sharper, angrier. The blanket fell, drifting to the floor like a defeated shroud, revealing the mirror. And there it was, the dark figure, now pressed up against the glass, its face inches away, eyes void and endless, staring directly into mine. It raised a pale, skeletal hand, placing it flat against the glass. I could see the detail of its fingers, the way they curved, almost human but horribly wrong. Its mouth twisted open, mouthing a word, silent but unmistakable, "Come." I stumbled back, crashing into my sofa, gasping for air. My fingers fumbled for my phone, desperate to call Lena or anyone, but my screen was cracked and blank, the battery inexplicably drained. The figure in the mirror began to lean forward, and the glass around it rippled. It wasn't a reflection anymore, it was an invitation, a doorway into that dark, suffocating room. I watched in horror as its hand pressed through, ghostly and translucent, like thick smoke twisting into my living room. The cold radiated from it, chilling the air, making my breath come out in harsh, visible puffs. "Lena!" I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty apartment, but no one answered. Only silence responded, thick and oppressive. My legs felt paralyzed, my heart hammering with each agonizing second as the figure pulled itself further out of the mirror. Its form was dark, indistinct, but I could see its eyes, endless pits that seemed to consume light itself, and that dreadful smile. It took a step forward, and I could smell it, a rank odor of decay and soil, like something unearthed from a forgotten grave. I scrambled backward, desperate, my mind spiraling. "Stay! Stay away from me!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. But it continued to approach, inch by inch, closing the space between us. In a last-ditch effort, I lunged toward the mirror, my hand reaching for anything, any part of the frame, hoping that touching it would somehow sever the connection. The moment my fingers brushed the edge, the room spun, reality blurring and warping around me. My vision dimmed, the apartment growing cold and distant as a darkness consumed my surroundings. When the world stilled, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't in my apartment anymore. Dust choked the air, thick and stagnant, and shadows draped the space in a lifeless stillness. I looked around, heart pounding. The armchair sat to my left, angled to face the mirror, but I was no longer looking into my living room. No, I was trapped on the other side, inside the dark room. And in the reflection, staring back at me with an expression of silent terror, was Lena, calling my name, her hand pressed desperately against the other side of the mirror's glass. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.